What if the biggest update in 2026 isn't where they are, but what no one is allowed to do to them anymore? What if the real change isn't new footage, but the absence of it? Because for years, the story moved one way. More videos, more access, more people trying to get closer. And now suddenly, it's quiet. No new clips, no daily updates, no constant presence of cameras. And that silence is not random. It's structured. So before anything else, separate two things. What people assume and what can actually be verified. Because those are no longer the same. The internet still asks the same questions. Where is Timmy? Where is Ray? Where is Lorraine? But the 2026 update reframes the question entirely. Not where are they, but under what conditions are they living now? Because location matters less than environment. An environment is where the real change happened. For years, the Whittaker story followed a predictable pattern. Discovery, exposure, attention, intervention. But nobody really stopped to ask what happens after intervention. Because after intervention, visibility doesn't increase. It decreases. That's the part most people misunderstand. When professionals step in, access is restricted, not expanded. Because protection requires limits. And limits look like silence from the outside. So when people say, we're not seeing updates anymore, they assume something is missing. But in many cases, that absence is the update. It means something is finally being controlled, measured, documented privately instead of publicly. And that shift matters more than any viral clip. Because for the first time, their lives are no longer reacting to the internet. The internet is reacting to the lack of access. Now pause on that, because it changes the entire structure of the story. Before 2026, the pattern was clear. Attention created movement. Movement created instability. Instability created more attention. A loop. And the people at the center had no way to control it. Now the loop is broken. Not by choice, but by enforcement. And enforcement is the word most people avoid. Because it feels uncomfortable, but it's necessary to understand what changed. Restrictions were placed, not just informal ones. Formal ones, access control, privacy protection, oversight, guardianship structures. These aren't rumors. These are standard outcomes when vulnerable adults are placed into structured care systems. And once those systems are in place, one rule dominates everything else. No uncontrolled exposure. No unauthorized filming. No direct access from the public. Because at that point, the priority shifts completely. From visibility to stability. Now think about what that means in real terms. For the first time in years, daily life is not interrupted by outsiders. No unexpected visitors. No cameras showing up. No constant interaction with people who are trying to document. No pressure to respond. No need to perform even unintentionally. Just routine, structure, consistency. And that may sound simple, but for someone who has lived in long-term instability, it's not small. It's fundamental. Now here's where the story becomes difficult. Because improvement doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet. Regular meals, scheduled care, medical oversight, clean environments, predictable routines. Those are not viral moments, but they are life-changing conditions. And the 2026 updates, what little has been responsibly confirmed, point in one direction. Stabilization, not perfection, not transformation into something completely different, but reduction of chaos. And that alone can change behavior in ways people didn't expect. Because when instability is removed, something else becomes visible. Baseline behavior. Without pressure. Without constant external influence. Without environmental triggers. And that's when people started noticing something. The individuals at the center of this story were never as simple as the internet made them appear. Because once structure was introduced, responses changed. Patterns shifted. Reactions became more consistent. And in some cases, improvement was measurable. Not dramatic, but real. And that raises an uncomfortable realization. How much of what people saw before was the person? And how much of it was the environment? Because environment shapes behavior more than most people are willing to admit. Now let's address something directly. There's a tendency to frame this as a before and after story. Before was bad. After is good. But that's not accurate. It's more complicated. Because what existed before was not absence of care. It was limited care under extreme conditions. And what exists now is structured care under controlled conditions. Both realities can exist without one being reduced to a simple label. Because oversimplifying removes responsibility from the system as a whole. Now here's the second part people miss. While some individuals moved into structured care, others did not. And that creates a split. Not just physically, but structurally. Different environments, different levels of support, different daily realities. And that split is where the story becomes more complex than most people expect. Because now you're not looking at one situation. You're looking at multiple realities evolving at the same time. And they don't all move in the same direction. Some stabilize. Some remain unchanged. Some become more isolated. And from the outside, it's easy to focus only on the visible improvements. But the full picture includes what stayed behind. Which brings us to the next question. What happened to the place where all of this began? Because while people focus on individuals, locations matter. The house, the environment, the physical space that shaped everything for decades. That space didn't disappear. And in 2026, it still exists. But under very different conditions. Less traffic, less attention, less interference. And that creates a different kind of outcome. Because when attention leaves, two things can happen. Stability returns, or neglect deepens. And without consistent oversight, it's not always clear which one cares. That's why the 2026 update isn't just about people. It's about systems. What systems were introduced? Which ones were not? And how those systems affect different parts of the same story. Now here's the key point. The silence in 2026 is not empty. It's structured. It represents a boundary that didn't exist before. And whether people realize it or not, that boundary is the biggest change in this entire story. Because for the first time, access is no longer assumed. It's restricted. And restriction, in this context, is protection, not secrecy, not avoidance. Protection. And that leads to the next layer. Because once protection is in place, control shifts away from the public, away from individuals trying to manage things informally, towards systems designed to manage risk. And those systems operate differently. They don't provide constant updates. They don't respond to public curiosity. They don't explain every decision. They focus on outcomes, not visibility, which leaves the public in an unfamiliar position, watching less, knowing less, and having to accept that not everything is meant to be seen. That's the real update. Not where they are, but what changed around them. Comment below. Do you think privacy like this is necessary protection? Or does it make people feel like something is being hidden? Because in part 2, we break down what actually changed in their day-to-day lives, and why those changes challenge everything people thought they understood. If you remove the cameras, remove the visitors, remove the constant unpredictability, what actually changes? That's the question most people don't ask. Because it's easier to focus on location. Where are they now? But location is surface level. What matters is structure, routine, environment. Because those are the variables that shape daily life. And in 2026, those variables changed more than anything else. Start with the most basic layer. Time. Not clock time. Structured time. Before, time inside that environment was loose. Unpredictable. Days didn't always follow a consistent pattern. Meals weren't always on schedule. Sleep wasn't always regulated. Activities weren't structured in a way that supported stability. That's not unusual in isolated, resource-limited environments. But once structured care is introduced, time becomes organized. Meals happen at consistent intervals. Sleep is monitored. Daily routines are repeated. And repetition is not boring in this context. It's stabilizing because predictable sequences reduce stress responses, especially for individuals who rely heavily on routine. Now consider what that does to behavior. When the environment becomes predictable, reactions become more consistent. Not because the person changed, but because the triggers changed. And that's the first major shift in 2026. Behavior is no longer shaped by constant disruption. It's shaped by routine. Now move to the second layer. Health. Before intervention, health was reactive. Problems were addressed when they became visible, when they became severe enough to notice. But reactive care has limits because it waits for symptoms. Structured care works differently. It's proactive, regular monitoring, scheduled checkups, medication management, hygiene maintained daily instead of intermittently. And those changes don't just improve physical condition. They reduce discomfort. And when discomfort is reduced, behavior often changes with it. Because discomfort that can't be expressed doesn't disappear. It shows up in other ways. Restlessness, vocalizations, withdrawal, agitation. So when caregivers in 2026 report changes like calmer behavior or increased responsiveness, it's not a mystery. It's a predictable outcome of reduced stress and improved baseline health. Now here's something most people overlook. Nutrition. It sounds simple, but it's not. Because nutrition isn't just about eating. It's about consistency, balanced intake, regular hydration, and in structured environments, those things are controlled. Meals are planned. Portions are monitored. Diet is adjusted based on need. And that creates stability at a biological level. Energy levels become more consistent. Mood becomes less volatile. Cognitive function can improve within existing limits. Again, not transformation. Stabilization. Now step into the next layer. Sensory environment. This is where the difference becomes even more significant. Before, the environment included unpredictable noise. Visitors arriving without warning. Multiple voices. Uncontrolled stimulation. That kind of environment can overwhelm anyone. But for individuals sensitive to sensory input, it becomes a constant source of stress. Structured care reduces that. Noise is controlled. Spaces are regulated. Interaction is intentional, not random. And that reduces sensory overload, which directly affects how someone responds to the world around them. Now combine all of this. Structured time, proactive health care, consistent nutrition, controlled sensory input. What you get is not a different person. You get the same person in a different system. And that system allows certain behaviors to decrease while others become more visible. That's what people are noticing in 2026. Not a transformation, a reveal. Because when chaos is removed, baseline behavior becomes clearer. Now let's talk about something more difficult. Identity. Because before, the internet created a version of these individuals. A simplified one, based on short clips, moments without context, reactions without explanation. That version became widely accepted, but it wasn't complete. And once structured care began, that version started to break down. Because the reality didn't match the assumption. Caregivers began reporting things that didn't fit the narrative. More engagement than expected, more responsiveness, more variation in behavior. And that forces a reconsideration, not of who they are, but of how they were perceived. Now here's the critical point. This doesn't mean everything improved equally, or that every outcome is positive, because structured environments also come with limitations. Less freedom, more rules, more control over daily decisions. And that creates a trade-off. Safety increases, autonomy decreases, and that balance is not simple. Because what looks like protection from the outside can feel restrictive from the inside. And there's no universal answer to whether that trade-off is right. It depends on the individual, their needs, their ability to function independently, their level of vulnerability. Now bring in the next factor. Relationships. Before, relationships were constant. The same people, the same interactions. Even if those interactions were imperfect, they were familiar. Now, In structured care, relationships change. Caregivers rotate. Interactions are scheduled. Connections are different. And that creates a shift. Because familiarity is replaced with professionalism, which can improve care, but also reduce emotional continuity. And that's something people don't measure easily. But it matters. Now consider communication. Before, communication happened within a closed system. Family members understood patterns outsiders didn't. Now, communication has to adapt. Caregivers learn, interpret, develop new ways of understanding. Sometimes that leads to better clarity. Sometimes it creates gaps, because no one learns a lifetime of patterns instantly. And that transition period is complex. Now let's connect all of this to one central idea. Change in 2026 is not dramatic. It's systemic. It's built into daily structure. And because of that, it doesn't look like a story. It looks like routine. But routine is the story. Because routine determines outcome over time. Now shift focus slightly. Because while these changes happened inside structured environments, the outside world didn't stop reacting. People still speculate, still ask questions, still try to piece together updates. But they are working with less information. And that creates a gap between perception and reality. Because what's happening daily is not visible. And what's visible is often incomplete. Now here's the key takeaway. The biggest change in 2026 is not location. It's control over variables. Time, health, environment, interaction. And once those variables are controlled, outcomes become more stable. Not perfect, but predictable. And predictability is the foundation of any form of improvement. Now step back again. Before 2026, the story was driven by exposure. After 2026, the story is driven by structure. And those are two completely different systems. One creates visibility. The other creates stability. And they don't operate the same way. Which is why the public perception hasn't fully caught up with the reality. Because people are still looking for visible changes, when the real changes are invisible. Now that brings us to the next question. If daily life has stabilized for some, what's happening to everything outside that structure? Because not everyone moved into the same system. Not every part of the story received the same level of intervention. And that's where the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. Comment below. Do you think structured care improves life overall? Or does it take away something important that people don't talk about? Because in part 3, we look at the side of the story that didn't stabilize, and why the situation outside structured care may be more complicated than ever. While some lives moved into structure, others stayed where everything began. And that's where the story becomes uneven. Because in 2026, there isn't one reality. There are two running side by side. One defined by oversight. The other defined by absence of it. Start with what didn't change. The house. The same structure. The same location. The same environment that shaped everything for decades. But without the same level of attention. Because once the focus shifted away, something else happened. The flow stopped. Fewer visitors. Fewer people checking in. Fewer eyes on what was happening day to day. And at first, that might sound like a good thing. Less intrusion, less chaos, more privacy. But privacy without support is not the same as protection. It depends on what replaces the attention. And in this case, that replacement is not always clear. Because unlike structured care environments, private living conditions don't come with built-in systems. No daily monitoring, no required check-ins, no external oversight unless something triggers it. And that creates a different kind of uncertainty. Because from the outside, everything can look the same. Until it isn't. Now think about how that affects the people who remained. Their daily life didn't suddenly gain new resources. It didn't become structured overnight. It continued along the same pattern it always had. With the same limitations. The same constraints. The same reliance on what's available locally. And that's where the contrast becomes sharp. On one side, routines are designed. On the other, routines are improvised. On one side, needs are monitored. On the other, needs are managed as they arise. On one side, there is a system. On the other, there is survival. And survival, even when it works, is unstable by nature. Now add another layer. Loss. Because when part of a family moves into a different environment, what remains is not just physical space. It's absence. The absence of people who are always there. The absence of shared routines. The absence of familiar interactions. And that changes the emotional structure of the home. Not in a way that shows up clearly, but in ways that accumulate. Silence feels different. Time feels longer. Spaces feel larger. And that kind of shift doesn't get measured in reports. But it's real. Now consider something else. Responsibility. Before, responsibility was shared within the same space, even if unevenly. Now, responsibility is divided. Some of it transferred to structured systems. Some of it remains where it always was. And that creates pressure, because what's left behind doesn't disappear. It concentrates. And without additional support, that concentration becomes heavier. Not necessarily visible, but present. Now here's where people often jump to conclusions. They assume that less visibility means something negative is happening, or they assume that everything remained exactly the same. But the truth is more complicated, because absence of information is not proof of either outcome. It's just absence, and that's difficult for people to accept, because uncertainty doesn't feel comfortable. So they fill the gap with assumptions, with theories, with narratives that may or may not reflect reality. Now step back again. Look at both sides. One side is regulated, monitored, documented. The other is private, unstructured, less visible, and both exist at the same time, connected by history, but separated by system. And that separation creates a question that doesn't have a simple answer. Is one clearly better than the other? From a safety perspective, structured care provides stability. From a personal perspective, staying in a familiar environment preserves identity. And those two things don't always align, because safety and familiarity are not the same. And when they conflict, decisions become complicated. Now add another factor, time. Because what you're seeing in 2026 is not a final state. It's a phase, an early stage of a longer process. And early stages are always unstable in their own way. Adjustments are still happening. Systems are still being refined. People are still adapting. And adaptation takes time. Now think about what that means for perception. People want conclusions. They want to know how the story ends. But this isn't an ending. It's a transition. And transitions are messy. They don't resolve quickly. They don't produce clear outcomes right away. They create new questions. Now here's one of those questions. What happens next for the part of the story that remains outside structured care? Because without intervention, change depends on internal factors. Resources, decisions, support networks. And those factors vary, which means outcomes vary. Now connect that to something else. Attention cycles. The internet moves quickly. What was once constant attention becomes occasional interest, then fades further. And as attention decreases, external pressure decreases with it. And pressure, even when uncomfortable, can sometimes create accountability. So when pressure disappears, what replaces it? That depends on what systems exist locally. And those systems are not always visible from the outside. Now consider the emotional side again. Because while structured care may improve conditions for some, it also creates separation. And separation changes relationships. Frequency of contact changes. Interaction changes. And over time, that reshapes connections, not necessarily breaking them, but altering them. And that process is slow, subtle, but significant. Now step back one more time. You have two parallel realities, one moving towards stability through structure, one continuing through familiarity without the same level of oversight, both shaped by the same past, but moving in different directions. And the gap between them is not just physical, it's systemic. And that gap is where most of the unanswered questions live. Because people don't just want to know what changed. They want to know what it means. And meaning takes time to emerge. Now here's the key point. The 2026 update is not a single outcome. It's a divergence, a split into different paths. And those paths don't resolve at the same speed, which is why the story feels incomplete. Because it is. And it will remain that way for a while. Now that brings us to the final part. Because once you understand both sides, the structured and the unstructured, you can finally ask the question that matters most. Not what happened, but what should happen next. Comment below. Do you think both sides of this situation will eventually balance out? Or will the gap between them keep growing over time? Because in part 4, we'll look at what this story really means. Not just for them, but for how situations like this are handled going forward. So what does this story actually leave behind? Not a clean ending, not a clear victory, but a shift in how things are handled. Because the biggest change in 2026 isn't where people are living. It's who gets access to them. For years, access was open, uncontrolled, driven by curiosity, attention, and opportunity. Now it's restricted, defined, protected, and that alone changes everything. Because once access is controlled, the story stops being shaped by the loudest voice. It starts being shaped by systems. And systems don't move for attention. They move for outcomes. Now here's the part that matters. This situation exposed a gap, not just in one place, but in how vulnerable lives are handled when they become public. Because attention came faster than structure. Support came without coordination. Money arrived without oversight. And involvement grew without clear boundaries. That's not unique to this case. It's a pattern. And in 2026, that pattern is being corrected in real time. Through restriction, through oversight, through limits that didn't exist before. Now step back and look at what that means. The internet can find a story, amplify it, even help it, but it cannot manage it long term. Because management requires consistency, accountability, and systems that don't depend on attention to function. That's where the shift happens. From public reaction to structured responsibility. And that shift is uncomfortable because it removes visibility. It limits access. It forces people to accept that not everything should be seen. But that discomfort is part of the correction. Because without it, the same cycle repeats. Exposure, chaos, intervention, repeat. Now here's the final question. Did the exposure help? Or did it create a situation that needed to be controlled later? The honest answer is both. It brought attention. It brought resources. But it also created pressure that the original environment couldn't handle. And that pressure forced change. Not gradual change. Immediate change. And immediate change always comes with consequences. Some positive, some difficult, some still unfolding. So the real update in 2026 isn't a location. It isn't a single outcome. It's a boundary, a line that didn't exist before, between public curiosity and private life. And whether people agree with that boundary or not, it's now part of the story. Because the story no longer belongs to the audience. It belongs to the systems now responsible for what happens next. Comment below. After everything you've seen, do you think stories like this should ever become public? Or should they be handled quietly from the start? Because sometimes the biggest lesson isn't what happened. It's what should never happen the same way again. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.